February 1945. The world held its breath. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, and somewhere near the Rhine, in the frozen lands between Holland and Germany, one of the most brutal confrontations of World War II was about to be unleashed. But before the massacre began, there was a mockery. A mockery that would echo through the halls of military history. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, the man soldiers called the GI's general, had an opinion about General Harry Crerar. And it wasn't good. Too political, Bradley muttered to his staff officers. His words were like distilled poison. The Canadians are more concerned with politics than winning battles. To Bradley, Crerar was a bureaucrat in uniform, a man who had risen through offices and boardrooms, not battlefields. An administrator. A politician. Not a warrior. Bradley wasn't alone in thinking this. Even the legendary Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, known for his arrogance and sharp tongue, wrote in a letter at the start of the Normandy campaign that Crerar had made his first mistake at 12:05, and his second after lunch. The British didn't want him. The Americans mocked him. Crerar was the commander nobody respected. But there was something all these generals with their medals and their arrogance didn't understand. There was something about Harry Duncan Graham Crerar that was about to be carved in blood and steel on the banks of the Rhine. Crerar wasn't a movie hero. He didn't have Patton's charisma or Montgomery's theatricality. He was quiet, methodical, a man who believed in preparation and planning. He looked more like a bank manager than a battlefield commander. 55 years old, balancing wire-rimmed glasses on his nose, speaking in measured tones that put people to sleep in staff meetings. But here's what Bradley didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. Crerar commanded the 1st Canadian Army. And that army was about to prove something that would make Bradley's mockery taste like ash in his mouth. The mission was called Operation Veritable. The objective was simple to state, nightmare to execute. Break through the Siegfried Line, Germany's supposedly impenetrable western defenses. Clear the Reichswald forest. Reach the Rhine. Destroy everything in between. Intelligence estimates predicted moderate resistance. Maybe 15,000 German troops. Maybe a few veteran units mixed with old men and teenagers. The war was almost over after all. Germany was bleeding out. How much fight could they have left? They were catastrophically wrong. Waiting in the Reichswald forest and the towns beyond were not the remnants of a broken army. They were paratroopers, SS divisions, panzer units pulled from the Eastern Front. Battle-hardened killers who had learned their craft in the hell of Stalingrad and Kursk. Men who knew they were defending the fatherland itself now. Men who had nothing left to lose. And the weather decided to join the German side. February 8, 1945. 0530 hours. The Canadian guns opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. Over 1,000 artillery pieces hammered the German positions. The earth shook. Trees exploded. The night turned into day as shells lit up the sky like 1,000 suns. 4 hours the bombardment continued. The largest artillery barrage the Canadians had ever unleashed. Then the infantry moved forward. The Reichswald forest was supposed to be dark. Ancient trees, dense undergrowth, perfect for concealment. But the weather had other plans. It had been raining for days. The ground wasn't ground anymore. It was a swamp. A freezing, sucking swamp that grabbed at boots and vehicles and wouldn't let go. Tanks that weighed 30 tons sank to their axles. Trucks disappeared. Men waded through mud that reached their knees, their waists, carrying equipment that weighed as much as a small child. Every step was agony. Every meter was a battle against the earth itself before they even saw a German soldier. And the Germans were waiting. The 1st Canadian units pushed into the forest and walked straight into hell. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees. Mortars fell like steel rain. The Germans had prepared every possible firing position, every ambush point, every killing ground. They knew this forest. They had months to prepare it. The Canadians died by the dozens, then by the hundreds. But they didn't stop. This is where you have to understand something about the 1st Canadian Army. These weren't parade ground soldiers. Many were veterans of Italy, men who had fought their way up that brutal peninsula through mud and mountains and German steel. Others were from Normandy, survivors of Juno Beach who had walked through machine gun fire to take their piece of France. They had learned something in those battles. Something fundamental. Something that separated them from parade ground armies. They had learned that when the world becomes fire and death, when your friends are dying beside you, when every instinct screams at you to dig a hole and hide, there is only one way through. Forward. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry pushed into Weiler. House to house fighting. Room to room. The Germans contested every building, every street, Every pile of rubble. Grenades through windows. Machine guns in basements. Snipers in attics. The Canadians took the town one bleeding room at a time. The Highland Light Infantry of Canada fought through moorland wood. The trees were so thick you couldn't see 10 meters. Every tree could hide a German soldier. Every shadow could be death. They advanced meter by meter, clearing bunkers, destroying machine gun nests, leaving German bodies behind them like a trail of breadcrumbs. And then the weather got worse. The rain turned everything into liquid mud. The Allies had air superiority, but the planes couldn't fly. The clouds were too low, the visibility too poor. The Canadians were fighting alone, without the devastating air support that had crushed German resistance in France. The German commander, General Alfred Schlemm, saw his opportunity. He couldn't win this battle. He knew that. But he could make the Canadians pay for every meter in blood. He flooded the lowlands. The Germans opened the dams on the Roer River. Millions of gallons of water poured across the battlefield. The floods turned roads into rivers. They turned fields into lakes. They turned the entire operational area into a Venice of death and mud. Now the Canadians had only a few roads to advance on. Narrow causeways through the flood. And the Germans knew exactly where those causeways were. They targeted them with artillery. They positioned their anti-tank guns to cover them. They turned every approach into a shooting gallery. Canadian tanks tried to move forward and were picked off one by one. Burning steel coffins on narrow roads with nowhere to maneuver. Infantry tried to flank through the floods and drowned in full kit. The cold water was as deadly as German bullets. Back in his headquarters, Bradley heard the reports and shook his head. The Canadians were bogged down. Taking massive casualties. Moving at a crawl. This was what happened, he thought, when you put a political general in charge of a real battle. But Crerar wasn't panicking. While Bradley was writing him off, Crerar was adapting. He brought in British divisions, Polish units, Scottish regiments. The 1st Canadian Army became an Allied army. Whatever he needed to maintain pressure, he brought in. Politics? This was logistics at a level Bradley couldn't comprehend. Crerar understood something fundamental. This wasn't about glory. This wasn't about elegant maneuvers or brilliant tactical coups. This was about grinding the Germans down. About maintaining relentless, continuous pressure until something broke. And what would break wouldn't be the Canadians. In the towns, the fighting reached a level of intensity that veterans would compare to Stalingrad. Cleve was a moonscape. Every building destroyed, every street a death trap. The Canadians fought the German paratroopers room by room. Bayonets. Entrenching tools. Bare hands. The kind of fighting that leaves men with nightmares for the rest of their lives. Gotch was worse. The Germans had fortified it with everything they had. Concrete bunkers. Steel pillboxes. Underground tunnels connecting firing positions. The town was a fortress and the Germans were prepared to die in it. The Canadian artillery pounded Gotch until the town ceased to exist as anything recognizable. Then the infantry went in. The fighting lasted days. When it was over, there were more German bodies than standing walls. But the Germans kept coming. Reinforcements poured in from across Germany. Young boys from the Hitler Youth who had been training for this moment their entire lives. Old men from the Volkssturm who remembered the First World War. SS units who knew surrender meant hanging from a rope at Nuremberg. They came from everywhere and they all died in the Rhineland mud. The Canadian casualty lists grew longer. Every day new names. Boys from Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver who would never see home again. Farm boys from Saskatchewan. Fishermen from Nova Scotia. Miners from Ontario. The cream of a generation bleeding out in German mud. And still they advanced. The Regina Rifle Regiment took Udom after a battle that lasted 3 days. Every street was contested. Every building had to be cleared. By the end, the regiment had lost half its strength. But they held Udom. The Canadian Scottish Regiment pushed to Calcar through fire so intense that men couldn't raise their heads without being hit. They crawled forward on their bellies through mud and blood and kept going when anyone sane would have broken. Back home in Canada, people read the casualty lists and wept. The newspapers tried to put a brave face on it, but everyone could do the math. Thousands of boys weren't coming home. This was supposed to be the final push. This was supposed to be the easy part. Germany was beaten. Everyone said so. But nobody had told the Germans. By the end of the first week, the Canadians had advanced 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers through the most heavily defended territory in Western Europe. 10 kilometers that cost thousands of casualties. Bradley's staff officers shook their heads. At this rate, the war would last another year. But something was changing on the German side. The casualties weren't sustainable. For every Canadian who died, 3 Germans died. For every Canadian tank destroyed, 5 German tanks were burning. The Germans were throwing everything they had into this meat grinder, and the Canadians were destroying it all. German units that entered the battle as full-strength divisions left as scattered companies. Battalions ceased to exist. The Wehrmacht's order of battle was being erased in the Rhineland. And the Canadians weren't stopping. Crerar rotated fresh units into the line. He brought in the 4th Canadian Armored Division. He coordinated with Montgomery to ensure continuous artillery support. He maintained the pressure. Day after day, hour after hour, the pressure never stopped. The Germans started to crack. First it was individuals. Soldiers who threw down their weapons and put their hands up. Then squads. Then entire platoons walking out of their positions with white flags. The will to resist was breaking. But the SS units still fought. The paratroopers still fought. The Hitler youth, brainwashed and fanatical, still fought. And they died in their thousands. Sulzbach fell. Xanten fell. Wesel was surrounded. The German 15th Army, which had started the battle as a formidable force, was being systematically destroyed. Not defeated. Not pushed back. Destroyed. The Allied intelligence officers began tallying the numbers, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. German prisoners by the thousands. Destroyed vehicles by the hundreds. Killed and wounded at numbers that seemed impossible. How could one army inflict this much damage in such a short time? The weather finally cleared in the 3rd week. Allied aircraft filled the skies and saw the devastation below. The Rhineland looked like the surface of the moon. Entire towns erased. Forests turned into fields of shattered stumps. Roads cratered and broken. And everywhere, the wreckage of the German army. By March 10, 14 days after the operation began, the Canadians reached the Rhine. Behind them lay a landscape of total destruction. Ahead lay the river, the last natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany. And the butcher's bill was staggering. The 1st Canadian Army had suffered over 15,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing. Entire battalions had been shattered and rebuilt and shattered again. The cost had been immense. But the German cost was apocalyptic. Intelligence officers compiled the reports. Prisoner interrogations. Aerial reconnaissance. Counts of destroyed equipment. Intercepted German communications. The numbers kept climbing. And climbing. And climbing. When the final tally was complete, the number was almost unbelievable. The German forces defending the Rhineland had suffered approximately 90,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. 90,000 German soldiers removed from the board in 14 days of combat. Entire divisions had been annihilated. The 7th Parachute Division was destroyed. The 84th Infantry Division ceased to exist. The 2nd Parachute Division was reduced to scattered remnants. Unit after unit after unit, erased. The Wehrmacht's ability to defend Western Germany had been shattered. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in the weeks that followed, there was nothing left to stop them. The road to Berlin lay open. All because of an army commanded by a man who was too political. When Bradley heard the final casualty figures, he said nothing. What could he say? The Canadians had accomplished in 2 weeks what his own forces had struggled to do in months of fighting. They had broken the back of German resistance in the West. They had opened the door to victory. Crerar never responded to Bradley's mockery. He never had to. The battlefield spoke for him. But here's what makes this story cut deeper than just numbers on a casualty list. Here's what transforms this from a military operation into something that should haunt anyone who thinks war is glorious. Those 90,000 German casualties weren't just soldiers. They were people. Young men who had been drafted into a war started by madmen. Farm boys from Bavaria. Factory workers from the Ruhr. Teenagers who had never held a rifle until a few months ago. Old men who had survived one world war and gotten trapped in another. Yes, among them were true believers. SS fanatics who had committed atrocities across Europe. War criminals who deserved everything they got. But they were the minority. Most were just ordinary men trying to survive a nightmare. And the Canadian casualties. 15,000. 15,000 families back home who got the telegram. 15,000 mothers who would never see their sons again. Wives who became widows. Children who would grow up without fathers. For what? For 10 kilometers of mud and ruins. For a river crossing that was already inevitable. Because Hitler refused to surrender. Because the Nazi regime would rather see Germany burn than admit defeat. The soldiers on both sides knew it. By February 1945, everyone knew Germany had lost. But the machine kept grinding. The orders kept coming. And men kept dying. There's a cemetery near Groesbeek in the Netherlands. The Canadian War Cemetery. Row after row of white headstones. Names and dates. 20 years old. 19. 22. Boys who never got to be men. Walk through that cemetery and try to tell yourself it was worth it. Try to find meaning in all those names. On the German side, many didn't even get graves. They were buried in mass graves or never found at all. Young men who became statistics. Numbers in a casualty report. 90,000 in 14 days. Think about that number. Truly think about it. That's roughly the population of a mid-sized city. Gone in 2 weeks. Killed, maimed, captured. Families destroyed. Futures erased. And for what? So that the war could end in May instead of June? So that historians could write about the decisive battle of the Rhineland? But here's the other truth, the one that makes this story impossible to resolve cleanly. It had to be done. Nazi Germany had to be defeated. Completely. Utterly. The regime that had murdered millions, that had tried to exterminate entire peoples, that had brought unprecedented evil into the modern world, had to be destroyed. And it wouldn't surrender. So men like Harry Crerar had to send thousands of young Canadians into German machine gun fire. And men like those Canadian soldiers had to walk forward anyway, knowing many of them wouldn't walk back. Because the alternative was letting the Nazis survive. The German soldiers dying in the Rhineland weren't all Nazis. But they were defending a Nazi regime. By fighting, even if they personally opposed Hitler, they were prolonging a government that was actively murdering people in death camps while the battle raged. Sometimes there are no good choices. Only terrible ones and worse ones. Crerar knew this. You can see it in the photographs of him during the campaign. A man aging in real time. The weight of command crushing him. Every casualty report another stone on his shoulders. He wasn't a political general playing games. He was a man doing the hardest job in the world and dying inside with every decision. Bradley never apologized for his mockery. He probably never even thought about it again. For him, it was just another opinion about another commander. He had no idea those words would follow him into history, a permanent stain on his legacy. Because everyone remembers now. Bradley mocked Crerar as too political. And then Crerar's army proceeded to destroy 90,000 German soldiers in 2 weeks and open the road to victory. The Canadian veterans didn't talk much about the Rhineland when they came home. What could they say? How do you explain to people who weren't there what it was like? The mud and the cold and the constant fear? Watching your friends die? Killing men who might have been decent people in another life? Many of them had nightmares for decades. Woke up screaming. Drank too much. Struggled with what we now call PTSD but back then was just called weakness. They had done something extraordinary. Something that military historians study and marvel at. An operational masterpiece. A demonstration of sustained combat power that few armies in history have matched. And it broke many of them. Private James Mackenzie from Halifax kept a diary during the battle. His entries from the first days are detailed, describing the landscape, the weather, his thoughts about home. By day 7 the entries become shorter. By day 10 just single words. Rain. Mud. Death. The last entry, dated March 9th, reads simply, "I don't know who I am anymore." He made it home. Lived until 1987. Never married. Never held a job for more than a year. His sister found the diary after he died and donated it to a museum. Historians call it a valuable primary source. His family calls it heartbreaking. That's what 90,000 German casualties in 14 days actually means. It means James Mackenzie and thousands like him, forever changed. Forever haunted. Forever trapped between the world of the living and the world they left behind in the Rhineland mud. But here's what the textbooks miss. Here's what gets lost in the tactical analyses and strategic assessments. The Canadians didn't just defeat the Germans. They absorbed them. They took on the weight of all that death and carried it home. Every man they killed became a ghost they carried. Every village they destroyed became a nightmare they couldn't escape. Sergeant Thomas LeBlanc from Quebec led his section through the entire battle. Not a scratch on him. Bullets that should have killed him missed by centimeters. Shells that exploded all around him left him untouched. His men called him lucky. He called himself cursed. Because while he survived, 23 men in his section didn't. He knew all their names. He wrote letters to all their families. And for the next 40 years he woke up every night at 3 a.m., the time they jumped off for the first assault, and relived every moment. This is what Bradley didn't understand when he called Crerar too political. War isn't about brave speeches and bold maneuvers. War is about men like LeBlanc who survive but never really come home. War is about carrying the dead with you forever. The German side had their own ghosts. 19-year-old Hans Schmidt from Munich, drafted 6 months earlier, wrote his last letter home on February 7th, the night before the Canadian artillery opened up. "Mother, I don't think I will survive this. The enemy is too strong. But I will do my duty. Please remember I love you. Please tell Anna I never stopped thinking about her." His body was never identified. He's buried somewhere in the Rhineland in a mass grave with hundreds of others. Just one of 90,000. Just a statistic. Except he wasn't. He was a boy who loved his mother and dreamed of a girl named Anna. And he died in the mud defending a regime he probably didn't even believe in, because that's what war does. It takes boys and destroys them for causes they don't understand. The battle ended, but the dying didn't stop. Soldiers who survived the Rhineland went on to cross the Rhine, to fight into Germany, to see the concentration camps and realize what they had been fighting against. Some of them understood then. Some of them never did. All of them were changed. When victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945, there were celebrations in the streets of every Allied nation. People dancing, kissing strangers, crying with joy. The nightmare was over. The boys were coming home. But the boys coming home weren't the same boys who had left. How could they be? They had seen things no human should see. Done things no human should have to do. The gap between the celebrating civilians and the hollow-eyed veterans was unbridgeable. Crerar attended the victory parades. Stood at attention while crowds cheered. Shook hands with politicians who praised his brilliant leadership. And inside he was dying. Because he knew the cost. Every face in the parade of veterans reminded him of 10 faces that weren't there. Every medal ceremony was a reminder of the men who would never receive their medals because they were feeding flowers in a foreign field. He never wrote his memoirs. Never gave interviews about the battle. When asked, he would say simply, "We did what was necessary." And then he would change the subject. Because what could he say? That it was worth it? Tell that to the families of 15,000 Canadian dead. That it wasn't worth it? Tell that to the survivors of the death camps, who owed their liberation to battles like the Rhineland. There are no good answers. Only the terrible weight of command and the ghosts that never leave. Bradley went on to greater glory. 5-star general. Administrator of Veterans Affairs. His autobiography was a bestseller. He died in 1981, honored and celebrated. Whether he ever thought about his mockery of Crerar, we'll never know. Probably not. It was just one comment among thousands, meaningless to him. But history has a way of remembering the small moments that reveal character. And that moment revealed Bradley's blind spot. His inability to see that sometimes the political general, the careful planner, the man who counts the cost, might be exactly what an army needs. The last veteran of the Rhineland battle died in 2021. He was 96 years old. At his funeral, his grandson read a letter the old man had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. "I am the last one now. All my friends from the regiment are gone. Soon no one will be left who remembers what it was really like. The historians will tell the story, but they weren't there. They didn't smell the cordite and the death. They didn't feel the earth shake from the artillery. They didn't watch their best friend die in their arms. I want people to know it wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic. It was just terrible. Necessary maybe. But terrible. And if we ever forget that, if we ever start to think war is something noble again, then all of us died for nothing. Remember us. Not as heroes. Just as men who did what we had to do and paid a price no one should have to pay. The cemetery at Grosbeek is quiet now. Tourists visit sometimes, taking photos of the neat rows of crosses. School groups come for history lessons. The graves are well maintained, the grass perfectly trimmed. But on February nights, when the wind blows cold from the east, you can almost hear them. The ghosts of 105,000 men who died in 14 days. Canadian and German, victor and vanquished, all equal now in death. They whisper a warning to anyone willing to listen. War is not glorious. Victory is not clean. The cost is always higher than anyone wants to admit. Bradley mocked Crerar as too political. The Canadians massacred 90,000 Nazis in 14 days at the Rhine. And everyone lost. The Germans lost their army. The Canadians lost their innocence. The world lost 105,000 souls who might have cured cancer or written symphonies or just lived quiet, happy lives. That's the truth of the Rhineland. Not the tactical brilliance or the strategic victory. Just the infinite waste and the permanent scars and the ghosts that never leave. Harry Crerar died quietly in 1965. No monuments were raised to him. No cities named after him. He was buried with military honors and then the world moved on. But his soldiers never forgot him. Because he understood something the glory seekers never did. Command isn't about winning. It's about understanding the cost of winning and being willing to pay it anyway, while carrying the weight of every life lost for the rest of your days. The Rhineland taught the world a lesson. Whether we learned it is another question entirely. Because here we are 80 years later and wars still rage. Men still die in mud for causes they barely understand. Politicians still make speeches about glory and honor while other people's children do the dying. The ghosts at Grosbeak whisper their warning. But the world doesn't listen. It never does. 90,000 German casualties in 14 days. 15,000 Canadian casualties. One mocking comment from a general who thought he understood war. And the infinite echo of all that death, reverberating through the decades, a reminder of what we are capable of when we forget that every casualty number is a person. A life. A future erased. Remember the Rhineland. Remember the cost. Remember that war, even necessary war, even victorious war, devours the young and leaves only ghosts. And pray we never forget. Because the moment we forget is the moment we're doomed to do it all again. They had done something extraordinary. Something that military historians study and marvel at. An operational masterpiece. A demonstration of sustained combat power that few armies in history have matched. And it broke many of them.